We will continue the conference with a presentation that has a very interesting title. It says keeping up with the cloud. I think these are the real stuff that we should be keeping up with. So you will see Diana from Adore Me. She's an expert in DevOps, in data engineering, and now in BI. So she's covered basically all the flow, and she will try to tell us how they've implemented the a use case inside their company, Adore Me. Diana, welcome. You have the stage.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keeping Up with the Cloud. So today we're going to be talking about what it means to start on your cloud data journey. From what you can expect in terms of processes, trade-offs, and more importantly, costs. Okay. But there's sorry, that bothered me. But there's more to cost than just the cash aspect. So that's something that we're going to be diving into today. We've brought to you a specific, story because we don't want to seem like we're talking out of our backside. So today's case is going to be based on what we use at Adore Me, namely Google Cloud, and more specifically, Google BigQuery and Looker as our cloud technologies when it comes to data. Well, more on the BI side. We've got a whole other area where we have a lot more, but this is what we're going to be talking about today. So over at Adore Me, well, we sell lingerie, and I am currently a BI engineer, even though I'm a fossil. Okay, I've been at Adore Me for centuries, and I've gone through every possible technology, so I'm here to talk about our journey through the cloud per se. So the world of tech is a rapidly evolving one, and the world of data is no different. We live in a vastly different landscape than we did 10, even 5 years ago. So data is now at the very core of everything that we do, and the cloud has had a major impact on it. First of all, databases are no longer expensive. So it costs very little to keep your data, and few people actually want to bother with keeping a physical database in-house anymore. Everyone just wants to return out of their data, and if I'm honest, I just want to know the revenue. I don't want to worry about, uptime, server replication. I don't want to know that. Second, data usage is also on the rise versus what we had several years ago. And data has never been more abundant. There is data everywhere. There's data getting off of your phones into everything that we do. Fortunately, to process all of this data, we also have a vast range of tools at our disposal that help us process it. But with these new tools, well, there's the era of the cloud. So the cloud is very important in the evolution of data. This has helped us accelerate the way that we look at data, and it has changed our day-to-day. So now we have all of these novelty data movers that help the average analyst get data from a myriad of different sources without knowing too much tech in the process. And, we have all of these powerful, I think I'm breathing a little bit into the microphone here. So we also have all of these powerful data engines that can get a lot of data in bulk in a matter of minutes, which is something that, 5 years ago, I couldn't have even dreamed of it. How did it change analytics, though? Well, for once in the past, data used to be very expensive to keep. And we're not just talking about the costs in cash, but also the time used to actually pull your data. It was also kind of hidden, so you also kind of needed a very specific skill set in order to extract it and then use it. You had to be proficient in, I don't know, SQL or any other scripting language to be able to actually get your data. It was difficult to extract. The technology wasn't friendly. It took a long time. It was difficult. It was sensitive and, not a very great experience for the average analyst. And we had to wait a very long time for it. So 10 years ago, I don't know, extracting 3 million rows would have taken forever. And now I can just do this and BigQuery and it's sorted. Now, data no longer costs to keep, but it costs to use. So it's easily accessible. We can get data from pretty much everywhere. And the average analyst has a lot of data at their disposal, a lot of data points to use to draw on important decisions. And we have a lot of self-service tools that can facilitate access to all of this data. However, with the abundance of tools and this new pricing system, we have a new problem to worry about, and namely cost management. So everyone wants to talk about how awesome it is to have your data in the cloud, but nobody wants to talk about the nitty-gritty, not so pretty side of pricing. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Different aspects of costs. Like I said earlier, it's not always up to just the cash that you pay at the end of your month. And by all means, the cost of our data is not new, except in the past, it used to be under the area of sysops. So it was managed mostly by the system engineers who had to actually provision and maintain servers that would be running our data and giving it to us. And well, if you were lucky, you would also have a BI platform to work it all on. But 10 years ago, this was still kind of a luxury item that few people could afford and even more use. It was also very, very slow. Self-explanatory. I don't think I have to explain this for those of you that were here processing data 10 years ago. It was a mess and a half. And we also have pretty limited tools to deal with all of this. Now, however, well, we have very low storage costs. So the cloud has had a tremendous impact on how much it actually costs to keep our data, from thousands of dollars that cost to just spin up all of these machines to keep it, to process it, to pull it for analytics. Now it got reduced to several dollars that it costs to just have a cold storage somewhere in the cloud. We have no more DBAs because if you're working in data, well, you don't want to bother about keeping that machine running. So with the cloud, you no longer have to worry about the DBA side. If you're not specifically aimed on, server technology and keeping data, you don't want to bother with it. You just want to use the data, and this is something that the cloud does very well. Over at Adore Me, our choice of database engine was BigQuery. So we made this leap back when cloud platforms are only just starting to come out onto the market, and it was still kind of a novelty thing. We did a bit of a bet there, but it was successful long term. And even in the beginning stages when everything was still kind of in beta, kind of still not working the way it should, we saw immediately an increase of performance when it comes to our data. And as a bonus, we were able to just drastically reduce our data storage costs. BigQuery, like many other engines out there, specifically the ones that are based in the cloud, is made for the analyst. So it's made to process a lot of data in bulk at the time. This is what it does, instead of the traditional row-based approach that many of us are used to. Unfortunately, with this mass analysis capacity comes a new usage-based pricing model. And with BigQuery, we pay as we use data. So the more data that we use, the more we pay. However, this usage-based pricing model has its advantages as well. All right. What it helped us with? Well, for once, a lot less stress. So I talked about being the fossil of Adore Me. So I was there back when we had none of this. We had no fancy BigQuery Looker data studio to deal with. We just had one rotten MySQL server on-prem. So everybody that needed data had to go through me. So they would come knocking at every hour of the day requesting data. And there was a lot of lead time to get that data. We were working on offices across time zones. The tech was a little bit slow, and by little, I mean a lot. So it would take a long time to get data, and we had a lot of hardware and software limitations to deal with on the side, because did I have indexes? Were they efficient? Would I be able to pull my data before the server cut it after 30 minutes? Nobody knows. And the systems weren't exactly very time-friendly either. It took a long time even to get the data in the perfect circumstances. And there was limited manpower. Since this was on the on-prem MySQL that I talked about, it was very hard to give access to anybody else that could actually use this data, because we had a lot of analysts even back then. We had people that were dealing with the data day in and day out. But would we want to grant them access to a server that is only just barely holding it together? No. So how do we tackle analytics costs? And more importantly, how do we tackle them before they tackle us? Because costs tend to sneak up on people. So we're going to talk a bit about how we can avoid any unnecessary surprises when it comes to the costs. And we're going to talk a bit about the Adore Me use case. So pretty early on, after we moved our data to the cloud, we quickly realized that we were being a bottleneck for our analytics team. Because, well, there were only 3 of us, there were a lot of them, they all wanted data. And instead of just hiring a whole team of people to just hand the data over to the analysts, we decided to cut the middleman out of the picture and just put the data directly in the hands of the analysts. Now, this was by all means not an easy move. It required a lot of trainings, a lot of workshops. We're still kind of dealing with the fallout for that one. But overall, we ended up with a very SQL-savvy team that not only is capable of drawing their own data, but they can analyze and draw decisions on it just the same. Unfortunately, this had the expected, unexpected, undesirable side effect that it ended up increasing our costs by a lot and even led to a few pricing accidents. But, well, those are all teachable moments that we can take to look back and see, okay, how did this happen? How can we keep it from happening again? All right, so we're going to talk a bit about the pricing stages that we went through at Adore Me and how we tackled each individual one. So in the first stage, when he had just migrated onto BigQuery, it was the lawless paradise. So it was like a realm of opportunity. We had all of this querying power. And honestly, we did not quite know what to do with it yet. It was still kind of, okay, this is cool, but what now? So this was downward of like 500 euros, which at the time, even considering a discount code that we had, it was still enough to cover both storage, transport, and analytics costs for a good long time because we did not have that much data. So the usage was still relatively, well, almost inexistent by today's standards, but we did not have that much cost coming into the system. No usage bottlenecks, so everyone was just like already free to use their data. And it's like, oh my God, don't have to wait 30 minutes. What is this sorcery? And the quick migration was also a very good bonus for us that encouraged us to keep going. On the second stage, we were still seeing a relatively low demand for data. So we focused instead on migrating most and eventually all of our data into the cloud because this would allow us to also get rid of a lot of technical blockers that we had in other areas of the company. And since this was very, very new, the attraction of novelty was really high because suddenly we could bring in this data that before used to be either siloed or very hard to deal with, very hard to extract. You had to go through all of these complicated procedures, and that's considering that you didn't need several hours of data cleaning afterwards. So interest in data slowly started to rise with all of these novelty data pieces that we started bringing in. We also wanted to distribute data for everyone. So we wanted our analysts to discover everything that we had available for them. And then we started pushing this data to every single person that wanted to use it. Unfortunately, this resulted in a rise in transport costs, but at this stage, we were still not really concerned about the cost. So we were looking at it, but it wasn't a priority yet. On the third stage, we finally started seeing a rise in data demand. So data curiosity was increasing. With all of this data at every analyst's fingers, they could make decisions, they could explore, they could ask questions that they weren't able to ask before, just because there wasn't that extra data dev filter that they had to go through. They could just explore everything. And costs started becoming an active topic. So between 1 and 10K euro per month, by the way, all of this is per month, they started becoming an active topic. So we wanted to start looking at it more seriously. And the first kind of counterintuitive step that we made in this direction was to add even more data into the system. Because we added all of the cost metrics. So all of the cost logs, everything that went on, so we could actually see it and monitor it actively through the system. The fourth stage, well, this was where things started getting interesting. So we had a very high volume of data, but also very high demand for data. So this was the peak of our data usage, and unfortunately where some of the pricing accidents happened. But instead of pointing fingers, like no salary for you this month, it was a moment to optimize and look at all of the gaps that we could cover. Obviously, just logging this away into our best practices handbook, because what better stage to formulate best practices on when data is like so widespread everywhere? It's so much easier to see patterns forming, as well as places that are soaking up more cache than others. And of course, we started looking at our internal systems as well, all of our data movers transporting all of the data, because yeah, it's not really fair to just put this on the back of the user. We also have to kind of follow the same rules. So we optimized a lot of our internal data processing features so that we could also reduce the costs from that area. And finally, this is where we saw our stabilization. So this is currently where we're at. This is our data balance. So instead of our previous system where we used to push data towards our users in an effort to drive discovery, now we made a system that allows users to still browse what we have available, but they can choose what they want to take home in their own project. So on-demand data has been one of our focus lately. Like we said, we optimized our data movers so that, with the improvements of cloud technology, we were able to leverage it for faster and, well, a lot cheaper in terms of processing. We purged a lot of the legacy content and a lot of the old structures that were both holding us back and costing a lot of money to keep up and to use. And we're doing a lot of active monitoring in the system. So we're looking at this not just when finance lets us know that the company card has suffered a 10K debit, but also constantly looking at how we can improve and reduce costs. So now that we talked about the Adore.me use case, let's talk about what methods you have for reducing analytics costs. First off, monitoring. So this may not seem like an active way to reduce your costs, but you can't know how high your costs are until you actually start looking at it. Because if I throw 10K in the room, is that a lot? Is that too much? Like, I don't know. For a startup, it may be a lot. For us, not so much. So only when you start looking at things in context can you understand how high your data usage is and if you want to do something about it. Dashboards, because if you're looking at cost metrics, it is better to look at a picture and realize at a glance where you stand rather than spend hours just sorting through logs. This is much, much better. And while we're talking about logging, when you're looking at costs, make sure to log not just the costs, but also any associated metrics that you may have, such as number of users, number of queries, frequency of queries, how much those queries are costing, because more often than not, this will all just accumulate at the end of the month in a very nice cash bill that finance has to sign off. But my point is that everything is important and not just the cash aspect itself. Cost alerts, because nobody wants to spend hours just paranoid staring over at the dashboard and seeing like, is this number good? Is it bad? Make systems that do the alerting for you so that they let you know when the costs require your attention. And this is usually when anomalies happen, like stuff that you really want to get notified on. Like, sure, you could spot it by staring every day at a dashboard, but who wants to just kill their soul and what light is left inside just staring at a dashboard every day? So alerts, I fully recommend them. Partitioning and clustering. When your data storage is on the rise and the more data that you accumulate, it's a good time to look at how you're actually using the data. Make sure to check to see if you have any patterns forming that you can optimize for, specifically in terms of storage. So we're talking about partitioning and clustering, but otherwise just indexing your data. Try to optimize your reading patterns so that your engine has to scan as little data as it can to get to the final result. And finally, last but not least, this is a point that I care very deeply about, education. So educate your users. Make sure that they know and that they understand the systems that they're working with, the limitations, the patterns, everything they need to know, because provided with all of the tools to help them on this path and armed with an understanding of how the system and the costs work, they're much more likely to not be a burden on you and help you long-term in the goal, which is ultimately to pay as little for cloud tech as we can, because it all just comes down to money. Conclusions. So when would you actually want to consider a change to the cloud? I know many are still running on-prem, and maybe it's not for everyone. So I'm bringing in a few scenarios that might help you consider this to be a good move. So if you have a long analytics pipeline, if it takes a lot of effort to get the data from the source into the hands of your users, the cloud may offer a lot more possibilities in this sense. Administration costs, like I talked about our use case earlier, where we actually traded off the cost of servers to the cost of just using the data with all of the extra hassle. If you have a high data demand with a low processing capacity, this also happened to us. And if you find that you can't just keep up with all of the needs of your analysts, if you just can't give them that data fast enough, the cloud may be for you. And finally, if your analytics are stalling and you're just looking for that spark, that shiny that is going to kickstart things into gear and help you really get the most out of your data. However, there are some things to consider if you're looking to make this move. First of all, consider what your user base is like. What changes would it need to sustain in order to support a move to the cloud? What's your level of data literacy when it comes to your users? And how easy would they adapt to a change like this? Because, well, not everyone is the same, but also think about what their needs are, because you don't just want them to adapt to your tech needs, you also want to make sure that you answer theirs. Second, do you need training or do you need tools? Ask yourself this question internally and be prepared for the scenario where you might need both. And third, of course, think of the cost of using those additional tools, because at the end of the day, the cost of a cloud migration is not up to just the migration itself, but also all of the additional costs that you incur while doing it. And since the costs are the topic of this entire speech, it is very important to monitor them right off the bat. So even if they're not large, it's good to keep them there on a little tiny window of your dashboard just to make sure that they're in view and that you are looking at them. Even if they might not be a particular problem, this will help you spot when and if a problem does appear. So make sure that you have systems that allow you to monitor your data, create tools if there aren't any, and as a bonus, make sure that you get notified and you don't have to actively look at it. And now this is not to say that you should not review your cost every now and then, but it's better to just get a ping if things are stable and you just see that somebody made a boo-boo over there that you wanna address. And yeah, I really wanted to keep this presentation short. So I want to open things up to discussion for the audience, and maybe why not talk about a few extra points that didn't get to make the presentation. So do we have any questions? Yes.
Hello. Okay. Hi. So a couple of questions for you. Have you considered moving to flat rate pricing as opposed to on-demand pricing? So I know BigQuery, all the other cloud providers also offer the option, instead of paying per query or by the amount of data that you query, you can actually have some sort of prepaid flat rate where you're essentially buying compute power that you can use over a period of time, and that makes your costs more predictable, and that's easier for you to sell internally to the people with the money.
That is a very good point, and quite honestly, most of this presentation was based around the fact that we do have on-demand pricing. But yes, flat pricing is also available, but it is important for it to fit your business model and your culture. For us, it was more important to see, like, where could we go with this? Because there was a lot of potential and we had a lot of ideas. We knew that it was going to grow really quickly. So for us in particular, on-demand pricing was a lot better. And yeah, for the flat pricing, it's a lot easier to predict. Like, okay, we paid for this much. We know we can go up to that, but it's not as likely to have pricing incidents.
Right, you're not going to start with flat rate pricing.
The very good thing about on-demand pricing is that, especially if you're starting out, this is very good for people that have a low data usage, because you actually pay how much you use. You don't have to make a commitment right from the start if you don't know where it's going to take you. Like, you don't have to just churn out 10K worth of investment right away. You can just like test things out and see where it goes.
Right, but as you mature, then at some point you can establish a sort of a baseline. You can say, okay.
Yeah, it's definitely an option once you actually know what your data patterns are going to be like.
Okay, cool. And the second question is there any sort of cross-charging mechanism inside Adore.me? Like, instead of like, who is actually the cost center for all of this? Is it the data team, or are the actual business units using the data get cross-charged based on what they're using?
I'm not exactly sure what cross-charging is.
So are you pushing the costs, basically just monitoring what they are using and pushing that into a kind of internal cross-charge to that business department?
No. So this is not something that we chose to do, because we also see a lot of return based on the teams that are the highest consumers of our data. So we let them have as much data as they want, and then we just optimize behind them. Like, we come with a little broom and be like, okay, let's tone it down a little bit. Let's see how we can use this better, instead of just cutting costs or cross-charging or interfering with...
More about you, the data team, not being the cost center, right? You're not the generator of the costs. It's the people who actually use the data. It's more of a, change in how the people with the money perceive.
Yeah,
it, right?
I would see it as a difference between theory and practice here, because like I could stand here on the stage and say everything, but the reality is that we're still doing most of the monitoring and optimizing. So we're the ones that actually keep an eye on things and just come knocking. It's like, hey, yeah, you used too much this month. Like, what's up? What's happening? How can we help there? You're welcome.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. My question is regarding the beginning of your journey. Let's say when initially you were like on premise, you had a, let's say, I don't know, MySQL or whatever. You didn't really have like data analysts back then, right? So the data analyst role just kind of appeared as you gave people power to access the data. How did you, I don't know, did you train people? Did you hire people? How do you convert normal business users into being data analysts and so on?
Thank you for the question. The short answer would be culture. So this is something very specific to us at Adormi. We use data in everything, and we started off with this culture. Like, everything has to be about the data. We had it on our company charter at some point: show me the numbers, show me the data. So this has always been there for as long as we've been a company. Now, the term of analyst, yeah, maybe we didn't quite have analysts back then, but we had people that were very good with data. So when handed this data, they could do a lot of things with it. They made some of the best decisions for the company based on just data that we extracted for them. So the bottleneck wasn't really that they didn't know how to work with the data, but just the part of getting it. So that, you know, I would say not so glamorous side of tapping into SQL and just figuring out how things work and how to get them. We tried. I mean, this was by all means an experimental feature that actually paid off. But we said, okay, do you want to learn this? And the answer from all of our proto-analysts back then was a unanimous yes. We want to learn how to get our own data, because at some point, tools like Looker and Data Studio don't satisfy the avid data consumer. Like, okay, you can fall into these patterns, but some of these people have really creative questions that can only be answered when they start drilling into the data. And this is not always available in BI and visualization platforms. So for us to offer them this capacity was like, whoa, and they didn't even have to pay for it. We did most of the training internally. So that was an added bonus, because they learned directly on our scenarios, directly on the things that interested them, which was also an appeal. Because it's one thing to go to a generalized workshop where they teach you, okay, here is how you make a select, here is how you do a sum. And then it's something else to have someone explain to you how an actual metric that you're using day to day works. So this was a large appeal for a lot of them. I have to admit, though, the training effort was a lot. So we're talking about several years in the making, 2 or 3 years, where all we did was build upon the culture. So now, whenever we hire an analyst on the business team, SQL knowledge is something that we look for. So they have to know how to dig into the data, but once they get here, they have like everything at their disposal, and they can jump straight into bringing value and answering questions. So I hope that that answered your question. Do we have any others? Okay, we have one over there.
I'm sorry. What was the problem with the spike cost? What happened?
Yes, the pricing accidents, as I lovingly like to call them. So when you're doing this whole initiative of training people how to use data at a level they did not before, most of these people did not come from a tech background, because I went to a computer science college. I know how databases work. I know how to use an index. But most of these people were just used to the business side of things. So they did not know how to optimize. They did not know that was even a thing, and how the BigQuery engine even functions. So they just did what any person that doesn't know any better does, which is they tried to extract their data. The problem was that there was a lot of data, and they were just looping into it without actually looking at how much it costs, because they did not have that knowledge. We did not train them into it. And that was the point that we started looking back and be like, maybe we should explain how this engine works, and maybe then they'll stop using select star from. It all comes down to education. That's why this is a very dear point to me, because I spent a lot of time just training these people so that they can be fully self-sufficient, and we only have to bring them the data. That's all we have to do, in theory. In practice, well, it never goes like that. Everyone knows that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the presentation was really interesting. I'm going to ask, how do you deal with personnel retention? Because with all this training, it really is important to keep them.
Personnel retention.
Do you have an issue there?
I don't think that
Because they do need to...
falls more into my area of expertise, but I do like to try to keep our users happy. So for me personally, that's always been a goal, because I've always been the person that sat between the engineering side, the development, and the business, because I could get both sides. I could also understand what the pain points of the business were, but also like what the devs were talking about, because they did not want to care like what revenue was or how it's like, we don't care, we gave you the data, leave us alone. And on the other side, they're like, why don't they give us the data? So this point where I think I'm in a very privileged point to be able to get both sides, but this has always been a goal for me. So how do we make sure that people are happy getting their data? You can't get everyone like 100% happy. There's always going to be something that grumbling about. But it's important that you get their needs answered, and it's important that you listen, that you occasionally sit with them and be like, okay, what do you think of this platform? What are you missing? How can I help you get the most out of your data? So I know this is kind of weird to talk in the tech side, but the human part of this is really important as well.
It's really important. So you are proactive about it.
Yes.
This
yes.
is the answer. Okay. So that keeps them happy.
That keeps the users happy.
Some sort of balance.
Yes. All right. Do we have any more questions? No? Okay, we're good. Well, we have 3 minutes left of your day that I'm going to give you back. Thank you very much.